Broadcasting from the commodity capital of the world, Zurich, Switzerland, this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
This edition to Insider's Guide to Energy is brought to you by Fidectis. Go to www.fidectis.com for more information.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sachs, and with me, as always, is co-host Johan Oberg. Johan, what's going on?
Doing good, Chris. Have a busy week behind me, but looking forward to it. And Christmas is coming in. How have you been?
I am doing well. It's been a busy week. We've been talking to a lot of folks. The podcast has been extremely busy. We've gotten all kinds of new subscribers going on. That's been fantastic. I've been getting more email from different fans, so I'm enjoying that. And then the day job is incredibly busy. It seems like a great time to be in the energy business. If you ask me, it seems to be a busy time.
Oh, for sure. Both in the traditional parts and also the new. There's so much news coming out and so many cool things that we're seeing across. And I was actually on the train the other morning and watching one of my favorite comedians building this comedy show around the U.S. energy grid.
There's a Swedish guy that talks about the U.S. energy grid.
No, this is actually an American. Well, it's actually a UK guy on US TV called John Oliver, but he did it on the US grid, which I thought was really, really interesting. And he's, informative but really funny. And I thought it was a good connection to today's show as well, where you have the energy grid, but there are some challenges. But we're also seeing some new opportunities and basically a transforming energy landscape.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of transformation going on. As an American, the U.S. grid has some anomaly and uniqueness to it as to how it's grown and how it's going to scale and how it's going to support the things in the future, or if it's going to. The one great thing about the podcast is we're global. We get to talk to people all over. Our guest today, I think, is going to bring some U.S. perspective, but I think he's got a bit of a European background as well. I think he can cross the bridge a little bit and share a little bit of each. I'm looking forward to today's show. I think that in interest of time, maybe we should just dive in and introduce our guest. What do you think, Johan?
I definitely think so. Let's bring on the star.
All right. So this week we have Mathew Sachs from CPower with us. Mathew, welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Johan, for having me. Excited to be here.
So I did briefly mention your company name, CPower, but maybe it makes sense for our audience to figure out who our guest is and maybe a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, of course. Well, CPower is a leading energy solution provider in the States, as you said, and we really try to be our customers' most trusted energy guide towards a clean and dependable energy future. But to put that really simple, we form virtual power plants by aggregating our customers, big energy users, DERs. These are folks like EV fleet owners, data centers, commercial buildings, farms, fleet owners of batteries. And we use that aggregated load and devices to deliver power and boost the reliability of the grid. To put a couple of numbers around that, today we provide 4.3 gigawatts of distributed energy capacity to both the bulk grid and distributed grids across the US. And this is capacity, but also other types of grid services, things like FR and spinning reserve. Maybe worth noting, equally important, at least to me, is why we do this. And for me, I started my energy career in solar after spending a sub-career or a past career in electronics manufacturing and private equity. And I really joined to build a business, but I caught this bug in the energy transition early on and really wanted to help drive this energy transition and kind of went through and followed where I thought the greatest barriers were. And thinking about it, I'm an engineer. I like technology, was inspired, but I started in solar, as I said, but then went to energy storage and then joined a utility. And now really is going where I think the biggest challenge is. I joined CPower about 2.5 years ago, and we're looking to balance the grid to enable more more renewables. So if we want a renewable future, we really need these flexible resources to keep the grid balanced. And we like to say at CPower, is good for the grid and better for the community.
So, so if I'm hearing you correctly, you joined this role a couple of years ago. You saw a problem statement, and you're saying you can aggregate users up to get more consistent predictability, or what was the actual problem statement that drew you to this?
Well, coming from renewables and solar, I'm a huge fan. But like every resources, they have their challenges. And the big challenge is, it's no secret with solar or wind for that matter, is that it's intermittent power. So is this past paradigm where you turn on a dial and you produce what you want isn't there if the sun's not shining or a cloud covers or it's nightfall. You may not get the supply that matches the demand. So how do you fill those gaps? And one way is to put a bunch of big batteries into the grid, and that's happening. But another way is to kind of adjust that demand so that demand now reacts to supply instead of supply only reacting to demand.
Looking at Johan
So,
here. Yeah, go ahead.
no, I think that's an interesting. So when you talked about the transition, because I love when you said this, you started up with solar, but can you explain a little bit more? Because I read a little bit about this transition that you kind of highlighted, and when we have on this show, we talk about a number of different things, and someone calls it the 3Ds, some calls it the 45Ds, and of this energy transition. There's a number of different things, but we tend to kind of come across a few things. One is obviously the decentralization of this. We're talking about digitalization, but one thing that we come across once in a while from some of our guests is also regulatory parts, because it's driven by a number of things, and I think this is also something that is quite interesting, especially when we start looking at adding more assets onto the grid. How are you engaged in this?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think, well, first we have 4Ds. Maybe good that we don't have 45 because we would need some more time. Um, but I think the 3Ds you hear most commonly is decarbonization, more renewables out there, more EVs, right? Which leads to the unpredictability that we just said. That decarbonization is the second. Decentralization is the second, and that's really we're seeing this firsthand. Our customers are adopting more and more devices at their site. These are things like energy storage, EV charging, even microgrids, and they're doing that for economic reasons for sure, but also for reliability reasons, and also for more and more sustainability reasons. They want to find ways to be sustainable. That third D is digitization. We think of that as an enabler. There's a huge amount of technology that underlies the services we provide today, different than where we were 20 years ago, but a lot of optimization, real-time computing, real-time telemetry that allows us to do these other services besides just emergency capacity. And that's what's allowing to connect those decentralized assets back to fill the gaps that we talked about from renewables. And last, and this may be a bit unique to the way we look at the world, but we're seeing disruption is the fourth D here. And disruption is things that we didn't expect to happen. So that could be something like COVID, when we saw load shift from resi to CNI, and now we're seeing a shift back to CNI. But it could also be these extreme weather events that we're just seeing more and more right now. So that's kind of the first part of what we see as those drivers. Now, how you brought up the point on regulatory or the regulatory paradigm, that's really different. That's what makes our job so hard. If there was just one set of regulations across the U.S. or across the world, we'd figured out the problem once. But each kind of region evolves differently, and both there's different needs at that regional level. Maybe some things are more important, and then there's different regulations. So I think when we look at deploying our resources, we really start with the customer and the community that they're in, and really try to adapt it to really be the best for that particular regime. And unfortunately, the answer is seldom the same for even the same customer in different regions. So I mean, maybe that tail part of your question I jotted down here is we are a resource. We're not a resource that gets deployed like a solar plant, but we're a resource that the grid uses and calls on us with our own strengths and weaknesses. We're not the right resource for everything. For instance, we'd be a really horrible baseload resource. But what we do have going for us is we can be deployed quickly. And that is really important because it's really hard to guess the amount of renewables that are there, or even that fourth D in saying, hey, we didn't know COVID was happening. We don't know when the next weather event is. And how do you get those things out there? And having 4.3 gigawatts, we're not the biggest resource in the world, but we're certainly, a significant resource that folks depend on.
So help me out. Maybe I just had a long day, or I'm a little slow in the uptake today. So what is it exactly you guys do? So I get the aggregation that you said in kind of the gobbledygook description. So help me understand that, as Johan would say, we like to ask the dumb questions from time to time. What is your business actually doing? So someone's engaging you to do what specifically?
Yeah, so there's two parts of our business, right? The first part is grid related, and maybe first to say is we sit between the grid and the customer. On the grid side, we take forward positions, we sell capacity, we sell other ancillary services, and we supply that through our customers. And for each customer, we go out there and develop a real customized plan. That could be turning things off, sending a shift home. That's how it was done 20 years ago, and there's still a bit of that being done today. But on the other side of that, our customers have adopted and evolved, adopted new resources and evolved. And what a lot of this is now is putting their generator, their microgrid, their battery, changing how they're charging their fleet of EV school buses in a way so that to the grid, it looks like their demand is going down. Typically, it's good if the customer may see no difference in their operation, but to the grid, they're pulling less electrons off the grid. Did that help clear it up?
I think so. Yeah, I just trying to kind of make sure I'm following the conversation. So you've got two sides on the coin. You've got the supply side coming from the grid, and you're working with the grid. You've got the demand that you control how the demand goes in the future, right? So you said something about being dynamic and acting in real time. So maybe walk us through a use case of something, a real time, a weather event, for example. You talked about one of these once in 100-year storms happening every week or something like that, right? So, we have a big storm come. What's the implications? Let's walk through it from one of your customers' point of views.
Yeah, well, I think it comes before the storm, right? First, the customer is concerned about disruptions from a big storm. Okay. So they adopt, say, a microgrid. Scale Microgrids is a customer of ours that we work a lot with, but their customers own things like vertical farms. And they want to put a microgrid in to ensure their resiliency, to ensure their product maintains any type of grid event. So they go out there and they purchase this microgrid, and to help offset the cost of that, they rely on some of these grid revenues that we provide. So the first big thing we do is we lower that adoption cost. In Scale's case, they do it as a service, but we're still helping with the economics of that service. Now, fast forward to your extreme weather event. A hurricane comes to Pennsylvania and wipes out a bunch of power. Then that grid runs. But let's say it's not a hurricane, right? Let's say it's a very cold event, and some of the assets that normally supply that aren't able to participate. In that case, we're able to run that generator and battery independently, by the way, to supply different support back to that grid. So maybe we're running that generator to supply energy or capacity resource for supplying energy, but maybe frequency is also off. So we could actually use that battery to help provide frequency balancing services back to the grid and help that whole community stay online and help even other assets from not going off.
And then the upside for the owner or the industry on that side, they're rewarded for that behavior by supplying back into the grid?
That's correct. They get paid for those services, and they even get paid in some cases to be available for those services in advance, and that would be a capacity market.
All right. And so your
Similar to the
company's
UK.
role is orchestration then of that, right? So you facilitate them to make that easy so they can focus on their core competence and then have this resource be an asset for them? Is that kind
Well,
of
there's a few things we do. One, we kind of look at their particular site, right? What else do they have, and how do you optimize their performance and the revenue they could get? Two, we provide the position. The grid's not always interested in buying 2, 3, 400 kilowatts at a time, but maybe they like to buy in big pieces, which by taking a bunch of sites like that, we could then put it together as a virtual power plant. So I think that aggregation has its value as well. It also takes away some of the performance risk, because if one customer doesn't quite get there in that time, we have 900 other customers that to balance it. And what we've got over the last 20 years is a very deep understanding of how customers perform, and thus can predict very accurately on how the portfolio will perform.
And help me to understand a little bit. When we talk about customers, who are these customers? Because a customer could be anything, but I would assume they need some characteristics, some specific, in order to attract the interest of your company.
Yeah, that's right. So our primary customers are large C&I or INC for your European audience, but industrial and commercial customers out there. And there are big box retailers, big heavy industry like steel manufacturers, universities, hospitals, even municipalities. All big part of us. Data centers is a very quickly growing segment for us here. And then there's even some residential loads that we bring in, but usually that's working with a residential solutions providers. We have a partnership with Sonova, a big solar plus storage provider here. And we dispatch Sonova, and Sonova could dispatch their fleet of assets. So to us, it looks similar to a large C&I site.
Great. So when you're working with these customers, we discussed the kind of transformation briefly in the beginning. We had loads of these discussions throughout. We in the industry understand this energy transition. We're now trying to kind of transfer this energy transition to create values for companies that might have seen energy as a pure cost. Now it's, they need to start looking at the 3 or the 9Ds or whatever we call it. But how do you rank these in terms of savviness of energy? What's driving them? Do they understand this? I'll give you an example. We had a customer here in Europe where a big retail chain who start putting solar on their retail on buildings, and literally came back and said, "Listen, we're becoming a utility. We have no idea what to do." So how do you work with these customers? Are they savvy? They know what they want and you deliver it? Or is it also kind of helping them on this journey? Because it's not done in one day.
Yeah, I mean, look, customers' background and knowledge really spans the gamut. Most customers, energy is not core to their business. So I would say most customers really don't understand it. I mean, of course, everybody understands it at some level, and they shouldn't and don't want to, because they have a core business to run, and they need to focus on how to make the best deal or how to run their university. But if you pull all customers up, we kind of alluded to it earlier, but there's 3 drivers there. And we see a mix of them all. One is economic drivers, right? We want bill savings, we want revenue from the grid, and we want to offset the cost of our current energy spend. The second is resiliency, more and more increasingly important. We've had some tough goes in California in 2020, the summer of 2020, and the winter of ERCOT last year. I'm sure it's no news to most of your audience. But this, and at the same time, productivity keeps increasing. So that the cost of going down, and not to mention the social cost around this, but just the cost of going down is increasing. So customers are looking to be more resilient. And then the last is sustainability. And that cuts a lot of ways. We have a partnership with a company called Watt Time, and they look at the marginal emissions, or really the hour-to-hour emissions of the gen stack in any region. And what we've done with them is just kind of look to see how much you could shift from 1 hour by shifting for usually economic reasons. How much carbon emissions are you saving? For across our portfolio last year, we did about 7,000 metric tons of savings, which is a substantial number. It's about equal to. Let me not quote it without. I'll check the number later. It's equal to a lot of tons of coal that are saved. But more importantly, it helps them save, and they could take that credit. But that's a small part of the puzzle. What they're really trying to do is facilitate more resiliency and more renewables for their community. So it's helping clean it out, helping clean up the grid and provide that local support.
So, I get the renewable angle that you're talking about. I'm going to go back to what we said in the beginning of the show, and we said, well, you have a North America centric. Your focus. You came from you working in the grid industry before you went to this job. You've been in North American industry for some time. So what's unique in the North American market to draw your business there that it's different in the European market from your experience? Because you also have experience, I think, from our previous conversation in the European market. So what's the difference between the markets? Like why does this work well where you're at, and why is it more of a focus for your business just in North America?
Well, I don't think it's, at the high level, I don't think it's unique to the U.S. I think this is a common problem or a common opportunity across different grids, really everywhere. I mean, we just came from COP26 last week, and this was a big discussion. We've seen it play a fairly big part in Europe. I think where it gets unique is going back to those local community and regulatory effects that we kind of talked about earlier. What we do to balance a grid, say in New Jersey here, may be a little bit different, not very different, but a little bit different than, say, the Mediterranean region in Europe, right? It's different rules, different customers, and slightly different problems with a ton of commonality, though, along the drivers and where we have to go. So, for CPower in particular, we think there's a lot of room to grow in the U.S., but that's not to say there's not an opportunity in Europe.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. That's fair. I just know that we're leaning really U.S. centric, and that's why I was kind of wondering if the opportunity cost is just different for structuring here, or if regulatory differences just drive a business model, making it much healthier in the U.S. for the time being, and maybe it follows in Europe in the future.
Yeah, in some ways, some places in Europe is ahead. The UK has very good markets for flexibility that are growing and going. We haven't seen those at the wholesale level yet in the US. Other places we're getting there. We're trying to catch up.
So you said something else in your previous comment that was interesting and I know you've been there a couple of years, but you alluded to the history of your company or history. It was much longer than a couple of years. I think you were saying that this has been going on. So how has this evolved, right? So we have distributed energy, virtual power plant type things. Folks have, just a bunch of different, whether it be solar or wind is growing at quite a pace. What does this evolve from? What was the old version of this? What was this in the previous life?
Yeah, well, CPower was formed through a series of roll-ups over time and really became the leader in demand response. And it really starts with the evolution of the grids itself. Historically, grids operated in a supply-driven manner. If you turn a light bulb on, if I were to turn a light bulb on here in New York, it's somewhere a generator is reacting to send the electrons out there. And over time, we've had advances in communications and technologies, that digitization trend we were talking about. And what it's enabled is this bi-directional grid. So in other words, like we said, we're going to lower demand instead of increase supply. And that's where CPower started. And 20 years ago, it was much simpler, right? It was hey, give somebody a call, turn off an elevator, send a shift home, and we'll drop load on that hottest day in the summer when everyone's AC is going. But that was our predecessor companies, and we've evolved with the grid and the grid needs and technology as it's gone on. And then, someone had the good ideas, well, we could run a backup generator, and that looks to the grid like it's dropping load. And someone said, well, we could automate that backup generator, and then we don't have to bother the customer at all, and it becomes a little bit more dependable. And then Someone said, well, if we're automating generators, we could automate business, building controls, and so forth and so on, till we get to today, where we have all these new devices coming out, like solar storage, microgrids, EV charging, and it could all just play into really our strength. So, there's kind of one way we see these greater deployment of renewables driving a need for flexibility. On the other sense, we see our customers really adopting new solutions at breakneck speeds, and we could use those new solutions, or the megawatts in those new solutions, to answer the problem of the grid and the need for flexibility. So whether for skill or for good fortune, we find ourselves sitting in a really good place.
So what I'm hearing is there's a lot of automation and devices that you can take advantage of to either reduce demand or to produce power distributedly, so that reduces demand, or appears to reduce demand. Demand's still there, but it's just being produced somewhere not on the grid. And then potentially you can also then take advantage of getting power back into the grid. So if there's an economic value to sell the power back, you can do that as well. So whereas in the old days you might just send a shift home, you might just cut demand very, use a chainsaw as opposed to a scalpel. Now you can maybe come in with a scalpel and say, okay, well, we can do this, keep your core business maybe functioning, doing these things, and fine tune the power demand. Is that kind of the business pitch that you make?
I think that's about right. I would say today it's really, for the most part, demand response still, or changing that demand the way it looks to the grid. I think if we were to look into the future, I think you'll see a lot more injection. And there's, for 2022 in the States, is basically an order from our regulator of our grids here, that says you need to allow these assets to inject, and play and compete equitably with other types of resources. But the plans and how each ISO and RTO will implement that are still being developed.
And so I'm assuming you have a cloud-based platform that you guys have developed that does a lot of this magic. Is that what you say?
Yeah, we have technology is not where we really talk about with our customers, because customers don't want it. But there's a ton of technology down there in a lot of different flavors. There's the machine-to-machine communication, all the way to the automated email. We're seeing it move more and more to automated real-time things for some of these more flexible programs. And that's where we see that value shifting over time. But some of the older programs, yes, it's you still get day ahead notice, and you can make your plans accordingly. So I like to think, that I'm pretty sure of where the evolution is going. I think most of us are. The timing is strange. Timing is the hard thing to call. So I think we're really helping with those summer peaks and increasingly winter peaks in the U.S. now, but also looking to do those balancing services as that need grows, and we're seeing it grow. So it's we have our foot in kind of the old regime and new regime as well, but really shifting our way to the new regime.
So does the regulated grid operators, or is the grid, are you friend or foe of them? Are you a partner of theirs, or are you kind of another step in the chain? Like how do they view you guys?
I hope they view us as a friend. We're a resource that they buy. So yeah, I would assume they view us as a friend. And I think there's particularly, us and we've worked really hard keeping our performance scores and our metrics, so that they view us not. I'm less concerned if they view us as a friend or foe, to be honest. What I want them to view us as a dependable resource. In other words, we do what we say we're going to do, because that's what really matters. But we're embraced. I think more and more it's become an accepted resource out there. And I think as we've in a lot to the work we and our peers have done to get there. My biggest fear is folks come in similar types of business models and do not perform reliable, and that sets the whole industry back from a regulatory perspective. But it's not trending that way right now. So
cool. Because I guess that's one of the challenges, isn't it? We're looking at a grid or an energy system that has been around for quite a while, and that is now changing, especially then with bidirectional, but also with smaller assets, prosumers kind of a setup. How how is it kind of working with the grid operators, but also with your customer in order to kind of coordinate this? You're coming in with maybe new technologies, with new solutions, with additional assets, and suddenly you have a system that's been working for 100 something years, and how does that work?
Yeah, God, well, it's certainly not your granddaddy's demand response. We joke around at some point, and it's that technology and real time, telemetry and metering that we've talked a little bit about. We've seen AMI in the U.S. Increasingly adopted, although maybe not as quick as I would like. But but that is what it allows us to do. That real-time communication combined with real-time optimization and computer-aided decisioning, AI, if you like that word better, really enables that to get that next best step. But what we need, honestly, is we need the grid to be advanced too, right? Right now the grid is the best invention of the 20th century. So we've read, and it is amazing, but it's designed in a very static manner.
Hmm.
Kind of like a building is designed to take a maximum load so that if we had a party here at our office floor, it won't collapse. But most of the time, there's a tenth of those amount of people in the office. That's how the grid's designed, right? It's designed for those maximum occurrences, and what we need is a more dynamic grid. And what I really hope comes out of some of the infrastructure investment and other things going around the world, but certainly in the U.S. as well, is that we get the sensors, so to speak. It's not super high tech stuff, but involved so that it can be operated not as what happens in the worst case, but really the grid can be adapted. So to make that a little simpler, because it's probably complex, if you have a generator and you want to export into the grid, right? And let's say, make things simple, it's a 1 megawatt generator and you want to interconnect. They're going to go look and say, well, what happens in the worst day? How much power is flowing through that line on the absolute worst day when people are pulling the most load and every generator is humming along? And then let's say that generator, and you could say, nope, you're not allowed to inject into the grid ever, because on that worst day. But then you get a day where that generator down the line is down for whatever reason, it freezes. Well, now you're still not allowed to inject in the grid. But why? That line has plenty of capacity at that moment. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. How does the grid, different grid operators, particularly in the distribution grid, which gain that visibility? And look, some utilities have done a great job of this, but for the most part, they haven't, and not because they haven't thought of it, but because that's not what regulators were really willing to reimburse them for. Now I think we're seeing that tune change a lot, which is going to enable even more, and that's really exciting. But to your point, Johan, it's a really exciting time, but there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a ton of challenges going from where we were to where we're going to be, and right now we're somewhere in the middle.
So how do you see this evolving? So if you look at the number of EVs, just the demand it puts on a household or the grid, and you got different. So you have your business users who may get the lion's share of the power today, but suddenly 50% of the cars on the road become EVs, and the homes have charging stations, and the power grid's going to change, right? The old maps aren't probably the same as they will be in the future. How is that investment going, and how is that happening here? Because from what we see, at least from doing the podcast, we talked to a lot of companies, a lot of folks putting a lot of investment into electrifying the world and doing it at a rapid speed. And if I listen to the current administration in the U.S. right now, it's behind that effort. So how is that impacting the grid? So take off your commercial hat from your company, but let's look more generally in the grid. What's happening there to support that?
Well, EVs and electrify everything will drive load growth, right? Unquestionably. It's just how much and how quick.
But doesn't it change the load growth, the dynamics, like you were saying, as to where that load is also being, like if you look at it, you don't think so?
No, without a doubt, it will change. I think, and it's going to be really hard from where we sit today to understand all that. There'll be some things that will be easier to understand, but this is why, and this is, you're getting to the heart of why I do what I do, because you need resources that can adapt as things adapt in ways that we don't know. So, one place we're starting to do a lot more work, and and I think others will be, is with electric school buses. Right, in some ways, it's a really, really good resource, and there's nothing more elegant than kind of using these same types of devices that are driving these challenges. I don't want to say problems because they're solving a problem, but those solving one problem does cause challenges to another. Um, but using these same devices that are driving it to then go back and solve the problem at hand. So I could give some examples. In Brooklyn, we're working with a company called Amply that's electrifying school buses, or they're managing the charge of electrified school buses, and we're able to use those same school buses and how they charge to balance the grid in New York, which is great. Now, that's not to say that's going to solve everything, but I think that's solving a lot. And the other way to solve it is it's not it's more transmission and more storage in line. I don't think there's, I don't think everything is going to be solved on the demand side. I think it's a big part and one of the more complicated parts. But this is a kind of defining moment of our future, and we need all the tools we could get, and different ones are going to drive, are going to develop at different paces, and let's get them all going.
Yeah, but I mean, I think we see grid storage coming, right? We've interviewed a few companies doing grid storage, right? Whether it be flow battery technology, whether it be gravity, whether it be, some other, we had mine storage where they were doing some sort of hydro thing in mines. So we've had a number of innovations there. So I think some of that's coming, whether we like it or not. It's just the investment's made there, and it's going to come, and certain operators will accept it and bring that in at scale, right? So we will see some balancing just from legacy kind of architecture, right? I mean, that to me is if you're, if you need to keep your base load, and you can figure out how to, to leverage the solar at nighttime or in the winter time from the summer sun or whatever the reason is, I think that's coming, right? So then
Yeah, without a doubt, and we like it.
So then the question is, like your bus example. So so New York, I imagine has a fair number of school buses. It's a fairly large city with lots of population, so there's probably a lot of buses. So what kind of impact does like a bus project make? I mean, are we talking for base load? It's helping. Is it helping for spikes? Like what kind of impact can?
It's helping for spikes. What we're doing to do is take away. Now, those spikes might come more and more. Like, it's no longer just that hottest summer day, but it's still, we are a peaking asset, so to speak. Like, it's, so maybe it peaks every day at 4 p.m. when everybody gets home, or 7 p.m. when, the sun starts going down and you need it. But, the duck curve type of effect. But it happens every day. And the great thing about the school buses is it's quick. Right. It's not to say that there's zero setup time, but it's months. Where building a new big energy storage plant, it takes years. We need to do both. To be 100% clear, I'm a huge fan and spent a long previous life in grid scale energy storage and grid scale solar. Everything it's very important, and we need the transmission to connect that. But the other thing that it does is local. So no matter what you do and where we get, you're going to put a big energy storage facility, say 100 megawatt battery, it's going to be in one place. And there's always going to be a local need in another place. So by going out to these kind of going down the radial networks or the true grids, you get this flexibility to kind of work through local problems and create local resiliency as well in some cases.
So I think we had on the show, we discussed it several times, and I like the case that we had. We talked about grid scale storage in a number of different ways. We talked about the peak loads, in order to stabilize the grid and making sure that we have energy when needed. But coming back to your example on the school buses, something that I tend to always be quite interesting is that this is good for the grid. It's good for society. Of course, we need energy, and we need to make sure that we have sustainable energy. But out of curiosity, for the school bus, so the company that runs the school buses, is there a business case for them? Why are they doing it? Is this a sustainability message? Are they actually making money on it, or is it just a pilot, or what kind of comes out of from their side?
Yeah, so our customer is the folks that manage the charging of the school buses.
Yeah.
But if I put myself one more step down that chain, with is where I think you're going, is I think there's a variety of reasons people do this. And I don't buy school buses, so I'm purely speculating, to be clear.
That's
But
fine. You can do that on this show.
yeah. Well, one, there is a genuine want to drive change, and then there's the want to project this energy transition, and that's really grown in the U.S. over my tenure in energy. Right, I started in solar in 2007, really, and from there, it's there. Nobody talked about it then. Now it's big out there, and even if you don't care about it, you want people to think you care about it, which greenwashing only gets you so far. Eventually, you got to do something. So I think that's part of it. Second is because everybody wants this, the government now incentivizes it. So there's some big incentives that bring those economics. Hopefully, make it better, but at least on par from what we're seeing. And I don't buy school buses, so I just take a macro view and I look from the top. And if people are buying it, you think the economics make some sense, right? They're not buying it to lose money. Um, so, but there's a lot of pulls there too, and not all of them are we want to green, the energy landscape. Some of them are simply we don't want our kids in low income communities, or any community for that matter, breathing in diesel fuel when they're on the bus, and that's a big concern as well.
Makes sense. So I think we've beat the school buses to death. I'm school bussed out. So let's see where else we can go. So I think from the conversation so far, for me, the takeaway has been okay. So we manage the demand. We got some tools. We need a more dynamic grid in the future, because if we have a more dynamic, robust grid that we can react in real time, we can do smarter decisions. One of the things I think you talked about, local demand and saturation, or local need, goes to one of the questions. I mean, the grid is the grid because of the history of it, right? If you go all the way back to New York in the early days and Westinghouse and all the really exciting when power was built in the U.S., right? And how we got the grid. I mean, they sold generators to individual buildings in the early days. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that we're going to have a grid. And so today, look what we're doing. We have distributed energy. We have microgrids popping up. So I could imagine a community with a solar microgrid in the community, or a bunch of neighbors pulling together. You're creating virtual power plants, similar kind of concept. So how does that dynamic change things, right? Because the grid's there. It needs a huge investment, from what I can tell, to get it to what we're talking to. So are we going to see more and more just local power, and people that are less reliant on the grid and not using that as the backup?
Yeah, I hope that's not where we evolve. I certainly am not a believer in mass grid defection, or at least not a believer that it's what's best for society. It's funny, where we are in New York, just down the block is J.P. Morgan's museum, and his house, which was like one of the very early dynamos, or generators that were
Yep.
accepted. And I often sit there and just walk by it and reflect on the same point. So maybe you hit a personal note there. But look, in the end of the day, the grid is super important. If you take a really small world of one person that has a home and an office or a factory, and you have a 1 megawatt generator, and he has 1 megawatt of load in each, you don't need to be a brilliant mathematician to realize that it's cheaper to put 1 megawatt generator in one of those locations and connect the two buildings with the wire, than to put two separate 1 megawatt generators. So there is, when you look at it, efficiency, that the grid enables efficiency. It enables us to build off each other's demands, and the math becomes much more difficult when you multiply it by 6-7 billion people and many grids and different demand curves. But the concept is still the same. It's more efficient. So I hope we don't get there, because that would be a really inefficient spend of capital. What I do hope we do is hit this happy medium where you get the reliability and the ability to green the grid that we want, at the by using these resources that are already out there and being deployed. So the economics are generally pretty good, as opposed to keep going further in defect. And the only way we get to that grid defection scenario, in my opinion, is really through poor policy. If we don't do anything, and that and folks take that back and come up with the next, that those technologies will still develop in other regions, and then they will be reintroduced as an off-grid product at a much lower cost point, and that's a very scary reality. So it's really, if we just put up our arm and like kind of stiff arm all these distributed trends and completely ignore them, that is the only path I see to getting to that really inconvenient future, and that won't be good for everyone. But I think right now and I was worried about that 10 years ago, to be honest. At this point, I think most folks have come around to see that there's benefit of a happy medium between the two.
Okay, so I get the economies of scale, and so what I'm hearing you say is that the economies drive it as long as you embrace the distributed nature, and that's part of what this whole conversation's been about, by creating a dynamic infrastructure that can respond and use the resources where they sit. I think that's what we've talked about over the last 45 minutes or so. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Am
I
I
think it makes
capturing
sense to me. Yeah, that's right.
Oh, Johan, what do you got? What do you know? I mean, I think I've kind of gone six ways to sideways, and I don't want to keep beating the same thing up, but I mean, it seems to make sense to me.
No, for sure. I think it's always fascinating to have kind of the storyline of kind of meeting the old with the new somehow, and see how we do this, and I like the way when we also got some customer cases. But maybe as a last question, this could probably be a show on its own. So take it as face value, and kind of see if you simplify it. But as a green tech kind of a pioneer, or working with this for a long period of time, working with a number of customers, but also on the grid side, are there any things that you see in the next coming years that this is actually going to be a fundamental part of this change? This is really something that you've seen that we might not seen yet, we haven't heard so much about, but we maybe should keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think where I'd like to see the world go is we're at Biden. We started it unidirectional. We went to bidirectional. What I don't think we think about enough is an omnidirectional grid. So take the internet, right? And the internet, we all generate information, say emails. We all consume a ton of information on the internet, and we store it, whether in locally or in the cloud, more and more the cloud, but we store information. And if I send you an email today, it might route through Frankfurt, and tomorrow through St. Louis. It continually optimizes. So now back up and let's think about energy for a second. In the world we kind of talked about, we've always consumed energy, or electricity. I'm talking about here, but now we're talking about that we're generating it as well, and storing it. And that's kind of the analogy to the internet. Now, could we develop the technology to really optimize that flow, so that today I supply you and tomorrow the power plant down the road does? And it's a little far out. That's not where we're making money today, but that's where I hope really starts to evolve, and then we really start to get to this resilient and grid of the future.
So do you weigh into that formula um, green electrons, as opposed to, Johan's got a data center and he fires up the diesel generator because we're at peak demand, and that's probably not as green. Is there some weight or calculus in that routing?
Well, I hope there are more and more green electrons, and it depends on what's supplying the electrons that are going into that data center. And in some ways, data centers are a DER themselves, right? And they certainly have a lot of backup generation typically, but that's not what I'm talking about. You could scale up and down many data centers in a very modular level to change that demand, and they're very good in enabling large scale renewables. Now, how you power that data center, I hope this is apparent, but I'm hoping it's coming from things like offshore winds on the coast, a lot of solar in where we got it, and a lot of good transmission to bring that out there.
Well, cool. Well, I've enjoyed the conversation. I'm kind of questioned out. So, I don't know if you have any final thoughts to pull this all together for our audience. I think I've done it from my perspective once or twice as we've gone along the way, just to make sure I'm keeping up. What are your final thoughts? So we wrap up here.
Yeah, well, first, just thank you for the conversation. I enjoyed this, and second, as for folks listening out there, as you think of different solutions, please try to keep some of those demand side ones in mind, as we're doing a lot here, but could do more.
Yeah, and from my perspective, Johan, I don't know about you, but we really hadn't talked about demand side on the podcast yet. We talk about new energy, we talk about creating energy, but storage. So I think it's been an interesting journey for me to kind of conceptually do it. I mean, I think it's pretty easy conceptually to understand what it is and what the power, the problem statement is, and then what potentially could be solutions. I don't know your thoughts, Johan, to close up.
No, I agree. I agree. We haven't touched so much on it, and I think it also ties into a lot of the other topics that we've had on the show. So it kind of wraps it up if we look at the series behind us. But I think it was really interesting. I think there are probably more to learn on the end of the customers. So we talked about, for example, the bus company. I think we will see more and more around this, not only pure financial business cases, but also, as you mentioned there, in regards to be part of this transformation society. You don't have the diesel fuels or the loud engines for whatever reason. But I think there's a lot of things, and I think this is where we're going to see more and more. The energy industry will focus on the kind of the grid and the assets around it. But I think we're going to see more and more interactions. We can call it prosumers, but I think it's going to be more than prosumers moving forward.
Well,
And
I think the market's going to demand it, right? If we get to electrification like the numbers we project, there's going to be oversubscription, and somebody's going to need to manage demand because the capacity isn't getting built fast enough to meet the projections from what I see. And I bet the market naturally demands it at a certain point.
Yeah.
Because it's going to become a scarce resource, right? You're going to have not enough to go around would be my projections, but that's unofficial, and I'm just a podcaster, so we're Well, thank you again for being on the show. For our audience, you've spent another hour listening to Insider's Guide to Energy. I don't even know the name of our podcast anymore. It's been so exciting. We hope you enjoyed the show as much as we have. If you did, please share this show with your friends. Please subscribe, like us, and we look forward to talking to you again next week. Bye-bye.